The man in my flight opened the overhead bin, looked at the flight attendant and said, "Careful with that one, there's a bomb in it," and then started laughing. Nobody else laughed. I was in seat 14A, the window seat in the same row, and I heard every word because he was standing 2 feet from me shoving his carry-on into the bin while the rest of us were still buckling in. The flight attendant, whose name tag said Maricela, stopped moving. Her hand was still on the bin door. She looked at him and asked him to repeat what he just said. He repeated it. He said there was a bomb in his bag, and then laughed again and waved his hand and told her he was kidding and that people needed to learn to relax. He sat down in the aisle seat of my row and pulled out his phone and started scrolling, and that was how quickly it meant nothing to him. He made a bomb threat on a commercial aircraft and moved on to checking his notifications before his seatbelt was even fastened. The woman in 14B sitting between us looked at me and looked at him and looked up at the overhead bin directly above her head and didn't say anything, because what do you say when a stranger announces there is an explosive 2 feet above your skull and then sits down and opens his phone? Maricela walked to the front of the plane and spoke to another attendant, and both of them went behind the curtain. 2 minutes later, the captain announced a brief delay and asked everyone to remain seated. 5 minutes after that, Maricela returned to our row with 2 airport security officers behind her. They stopped at row 14 and asked the man to identify himself. His name was Hinato. They asked him to stand up. He asked why. They said they received a report of a threatening statement aboard the aircraft and needed him to deplane immediately. Hinato told them it was a joke. He said he was a sales representative for a plumbing supply company on his way to a regional conference and was just trying to be funny because flying made him nervous. The officers told him that making a statement about an explosive device on a commercial aircraft was a federal offense regardless of intent and that he needed to exit the plane now. Hinato looked around the cabin expecting someone to back him up. Nobody did. The woman in 14B pressed herself flat into her seat to let him pass. He walked up the aisle with the 2 officers behind him, and every single passenger watched him go in complete silence. A 3rd officer came on board with a trained dog. The dog went through the entire cabin and checked every bin and every row and under every seat. This took 22 minutes. 163 passengers sat still and quiet while a trained animal searched the aircraft because a man in a polo shirt decided the word bomb was entertainment at the overhead bin. We were delayed over an hour total. The family in row 9 had a connecting flight, and the mother was on the phone trying to rebook while holding a toddler in her lap. A man in row 20 was traveling for a medical procedure scheduled for that evening and asked the attendant if there was any way to speed things up because his appointment could not be moved. A woman near the front of the cabin was crying quietly because she had a fear of flying, and the announcement of a delay following a bomb comment convinced her she was going to die on that plane. All of this because Hinato from Plumbing Supply Sales wanted a laugh. When we finally landed, I told myself the system would handle it. Hinato had been detained at the departure airport, questioned for over 3 hours, and placed on the airline's restricted list pending investigation. His bag contained dress shoes and a laptop and samples of faucet hardware for the conference he was no longer attending. That was supposed to be the end of my involvement. But a few days later, I got a call from the airline's investigation office asking if I would provide a written witness statement. I said yes immediately. The woman explained that Hinato was contesting his restricted status. He had filed a formal dispute claiming the whole thing was exaggerated, that he never made a real threat, and that the response on the plane was way out of proportion to what actually happened. After I hung up, I just stood there at my dining table holding my phone. Hinato was actually fighting this. He actually sat in front of someone and said the whole thing was blown out of proportion. He said the word bomb on a plane full of people, and now he was telling the airline it was exaggerated. I sat down that night with my laptop and the form pulled up and started writing. I didn't rush it. I went through every single thing I saw and heard, step by step, from the moment he shoved his bag into the bin to the moment the officers walked him up the aisle. I wrote down his exact words. "Careful with that one, there's a bomb in it." I wrote down that Maricela asked him to repeat himself and he said it again. I wrote down that he laughed both times. I wrote down the dog, the 22 minutes, the family in row 9, the man with the medical appointment, the woman who was crying near the front. I wrote it all out the way it happened because Hinato wanted to call it exaggerated, and I wasn't going to let my memory get soft just because time had passed. 2 days after I submitted the statement, I got a follow-up email saying Hinato had hired a lawyer. The lawyer was arguing that witness statements were taken under pressure and that the restricted list process lacked due process. I hit reply and typed yes, I would speak with the airline's legal team. I would say the same thing in person that I said in writing because the truth doesn't change just because someone hires a lawyer to argue against it. A week later, the airline's legal contact called to tell me that Hinato's lawyer had filed a formal request for the names of all witnesses who submitted statements. Because this was now a formal proceeding, the airline was required to share that information. My name was now part of a legal file. Hinato would see it. His lawyer would see it. I was no longer the anonymous woman in 14A. I was a named participant in a man's fight to get back on airplanes, and something told me he wasn't the type to just let that go. The trade expo was 3 weeks after the flight. My company had a booth reserved, and I had been looking forward to it for months. I got to the convention center early on the first morning and was unpacking display materials when I looked across the exhibition floor and saw him, Hinato, standing behind a table about 40 yards away, arranging product samples and talking to the guy next to him like it was any other Tuesday. His company name was printed on the banner behind him, Plumbing Supply. Same industry circle I worked in, just a different corner of it. He must have driven to the conference because he wasn't flying anywhere with his name on a restricted list. My hand stopped moving. I set down what I was holding and took a breath and told myself this was a coincidence. It was a regional expo, hundreds of companies in related fields all showing up at the same venue. I just had to stay at my booth and avoid him for 2 days. For the first 2 hours it worked. I talked to vendors, handed out samples, stayed in my lane. Then the expo broke for a networking lunch and I got my plate and sat down at a table near the window with a couple of people from a supply chain company I'd been chatting with. I was cutting into a piece of chicken when I saw movement to my left and looked up, and there was Hinato. He was walking toward my table with a full plate and a big smile on his face like he had just spotted his best friend. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down before I could say a word. "Hey, I know you," he said. 14A, right, small world. His tone was light and warm and completely relaxed, like we had a good story between us us instead of a federal incident report. I didn't smile back. I looked at him and said nothing for a second. He leaned in and lowered his voice. Listen, he said. I know this whole thing got out of hand. I've been dealing with lawyers and airline people for weeks, and it's honestly ruining my life. I just want to put it behind me. Can we talk like adults? I set my fork down and looked him right in the face and told him I submitted an honest account of what happened on that plane, and I had nothing else to say to him. Hanato's smile stayed, but it got tighter. An honest account, he repeated. He leaned back. You mean your version? Because my version is that I made a dumb joke and now I can't do my job. I didn't take the bait. I picked my fork back up and looked at my plate because I was done talking to him. That's when another man walked up and sat in the open chair next to me. His badge said Irving. Hanato pivoted so fast it almost made my head spin. He leaned toward Irving and told him the airline had flagged him over a misunderstanding and that some people on the flight took it way too personally. He glanced at me when he said that last part. Just a quick look, just enough to make sure I knew he was talking about me without saying my name. I felt my face get hot. I could feel the flush creeping up my neck and I hated it because it made me look emotional when what I actually was calm. So I looked at Irving and said it plain. He told a flight attendant there was a bomb in his bag on a plane full of passengers, including children. Irving's face went still. His jaw tightened and he set his fork down like he had lost his appetite in one sentence. The supply chain people at the table had completely stopped pretending to eat. The warmth left Hanato's face like someone had flipped a switch. He pushed his chair back and stood up and said this was exactly what he was talking about, that I was making it sound like he was threatening people when he was just nervous and said something stupid. I told him I hadn't followed him anywhere, that he walked up to my table and sat down himself. Hanato stood there for a second, then grabbed his plate and left. After the lunch incident, I thought Hanato would avoid me for the rest of the conference. I was wrong. He spent the next day and a half telling anyone who would listen that I had a personal grudge against him, that I was vindictive, that I was trying to get him fired over a harmless comment. I heard this secondhand from Irving, who came to my booth between sessions and said I should know what he was saying because it was getting around. A vendor from a pipe fitting company stopped by my booth and told me Hanato had described me as that woman who tried to get me arrested on a plane. A man from a heating company asked me casually if it was true that I reported someone to the airline out of spite. Before lunch, a third person, a woman who worked for an industrial supply distributor, said she had been sitting with Hanato at breakfast, and he spent 10 minutes talking about how one passenger blew a joke out of proportion and cost him his ability to travel for work. 3 people in one morning, 3 different conversations where Hanato had already planted his version before I even opened my mouth. And the thing that made it work was that he told it with a smile and a shrug like it was the most harmless thing in the world. He made it sound like I was the aggressor. That was his gift. He could shrink anything down to nothing as long as he was the one telling it. That night, I sat on the bed in my hotel room and called my coworker Emmy. She listened to everything and then said something that hit me like a brick. He's literally doing the thing he did on the plane, she said. He says something reckless and then acts like everyone else is the problem for reacting. She was right. On the plane, he said bomb and then told Maricela people needed to learn to relax. At the conference, he was telling strangers I was vindictive and then walking around like he was the reasonable one. Same pattern, same move, just a different room. Emmy told me I needed to start documenting everything, and then she told me something I hadn't considered yet. I still had Maricela's contact information from the airline's investigation process. The next morning, I texted Maricela and told her about the conference, that Hanato was here and had been telling everyone his version all week. I asked if she would be willing to write a short statement I could share if I needed to. Maricela responded within an hour. Her message was short. I'll do you one better, she wrote. I'm off duty that night. I'll come in person if you want. He lied to my face and then told security I overreacted. I haven't forgotten. Irving came by my booth that afternoon and mentioned the closing mixer that evening had a short open mic segment where people could get up and share a story before everyone headed home. Something clicked when he said that. An open mic. A room full of the same people Hanato had been telling his version to all week. I told Irving what I was thinking. I wasn't going to make a scene. I just needed people in the room who knew the truth and were willing to say it if the moment came. Irving looked at me for a second and nodded. I'm in, he said. I heard his version 3 times this week and every time it got smaller. I texted Maricela back and confirmed the time and location. She said she would be there. The closing mixer was in a banquet hall connected to the conference hotel. Round tables, a long bar along the back wall, string lights, and a small stage in the corner with a microphone on a stand. I got there 40 minutes before the open mic segment was supposed to start and scanned the room. It took me 3 seconds to find Hanato. He was at the bar with a small group, drink in hand, laughing about something. He looked comfortable. He looked like a guy who owned the room. Then he saw me. He didn't look away. He raised his glass in my direction, slow and easy, like we were old rivals in some friendly competition. Like this was a game and he was winning and he wanted me to know it. I didn't react. I walked to a table near the open mic area and sat down and waited. Then my phone buzzed. Maricela. My car broke down 20 minutes from the venue. The message said, waiting for a tow. I'm so sorry. I'm trying to get a ride, but I might not make it in time. I read it twice, set the phone down, picked it up and read it a third time because I needed the words to say something different. They didn't change. Without Maricela in the room, it was just me, my word against Hanato's. And Hanato had spent 2 full days working this crowd. He had charmed them. He had made them laugh. He had turned me into the villain of his story and himself into the victim. If I got up in front of all those people and accused him alone, with no one to back me up, it would look exactly like what he had been saying about me all week. I grabbed my phone and jacket and walked into the hotel lobby and called Emmy. Maricela might not make it, I said. What do I do? Emmy didn't miss a beat. Don't accuse him, she said. Ask him to tell his version, in front of everyone, and then correct the parts he leaves out. Irving came around the corner from the direction of the restrooms and took one look at my face and stopped walking. I told him Maricela's car broke down. He set his drink on a lobby table and thought for a second and then said, he can't help himself. Every time he told it this week, he left out the dog and the delay and the woman who was crying. He always makes it smaller than it was. Let him do that in front of the whole room and then ask him about the parts he skipped. Something settled inside me. Hanato's weakness wasn't that he was a liar. His weakness was that he honestly believed what he was saying. He genuinely thought the joke was harmless. He genuinely thought everyone was overreacting. And because of that, every single time he told it, he left out the same things. The dog, the delay, the family who missed their flight, the man traveling for a medical procedure, the woman crying near the front. He left those people out because in his mind they were never part of the story. The story was always about him. And if I let him tell that story in front of a room full of people, and then simply asked about the parts he left out, the room would hear the gap for themselves. I walked back into the banquet hall. Hanato loved attention. He loved being the funny guy. He had been telling his version of the plane story to anyone who would listen all week. And now there was a microphone and a room full of those same people. He was heading for that microphone like it was a stage built for him. I sat down and waited. My phone buzzed. Maricela, got a ride. 10 minutes out. Hanato picked up the mic and tapped it twice. He looked out at the room and grinned and made a joke about the conference lunch that got a real laugh, the kind where people nod because it landed. He let the laughter settle and then shifted his weight and said, okay, real talk for a second. He wanted to share something that happened to him recently and set the record straight. He said he was on a flight a few weeks ago and made a silly comment at the overhead bin. Just one of those dumb things you say when you're nervous and trying to be funny, and the airline completely lost their minds. He said they brought security on board, questioned him for hours, treated him like he actually did something wrong when all he did was open his mouth at the wrong time. He laughed to himself and said all because of one word, and apparently that made him a criminal. A few people in the room made sympathetic sounds. Then he said the worst part was that someone on the flight filed a formal statement against him, and now he couldn't fly for work anymore. He glanced in my direction when he said that. Quick, but on purpose. He spread his hands out and said, I sell faucets. I'm not exactly a threat to national security. More laughter. He had them. He was winning the room the way he always wins rooms, with a smile and a shrug and a version of the truth that only had one person in it. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I didn't rush. I walked to the front of the room and stopped a few feet from Hanato, and looked at the room and said, can I add some context? The room went fully quiet. I didn't take the microphone. The room was quiet enough that my voice carried on its own. I said I was the passenger in 14A. I said I was sitting 2 feet away when Hanato opened the overhead bin and looked at the flight attendant and said, and I used his exact words, careful with that one, there's a bomb in it. I said the flight attendant asked him to repeat what he said, and he repeated it. He said it twice. I said a trained security dog was brought onto the aircraft and searched every row, every seat, and every overhead bin on that plane. I said the search took 22 minutes. I said a family in row 9 missed their connecting flight because of the delay. I said a man in row 20 was traveling for a medical procedure that could not be rescheduled, and he sat in his seat watching the clock while the dog worked through the cabin. I said a woman near the front of the plane was crying quietly into her hands because she had a fear of flying, and when she heard the word bomb followed by a delay announcement, she believed she was going to die on that aircraft. I said the total delay was over an hour. I said 163 passengers sat in their seats and waited while the plane was searched because of what he said. I did not raise my voice. I did not call him a name. I just filled in every single detail he left out. The room was completely silent. Not the polite silence of people waiting for the next speaker. The heavy silence of people realizing they just heard 2 very different stories about the same event, and one of them had 162 people missing from it. Hanato shifted his weight. Okay, he said. I get it. It was a bad joke. But you're acting like I actually had a bomb. I sell plumbing supplies. He said it with a little laugh, trying to pull the room back to his side. Nobody on that plane knew you sold plumbing supplies, I said. All they knew was that a man just said the word bomb 2 feet above their heads. A voice came from the back of the room. She's right. Every head turned. Maricela was standing in the doorway, still wearing her coat, hair a little messy from the wind. She walked forward into the room past the tables and stopped about 10 feet from the stage and looked directly at Hanato. I was the flight attendant, she said. I'm the one who reported it, and I'd do it again. Because when someone says there's a bomb on my plane, I don't get to assume they're joking. I have 163 people to protect, and you made every single one of them afraid. Hanato opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The mic was still in his hand. Maricela didn't look away from him. Then Irving stood up from his table near the front. For the record, he said, he told me this story 3 times this week. Each time it got smaller. He never mentioned the dog. He never mentioned the crying woman. He never mentioned the family who missed their flight. Every time he told it, he was the only person in the story. Irving sat back down. Hanato looked at the microphone in his hand like he had forgotten it was there. He set it down on the table next to the stage. He didn't pick up his jacket. He didn't wave to anyone or try one more time to win the room back. He just turned and walked toward the exit. As he passed my table, he slowed down and stopped close enough that I could hear him when he barely made a sound. You didn't have to do this, he whispered. I looked at him. You did this, I said. I just didn't let you erase it. Hanato held my eyes for half a second and then walked through the doorway and out of the banquet hall. Nobody followed him. Maricela pulled out the chair next to mine and sat down and put her hand on my arm and squeezed once and didn't say anything because she didn't have to.